Melissa, how are you doing?
Very well. Are you in Arizona at the moment?
I am, and it's heating up. What do we got? Too much. Well, no, it's
It's,
still pretty mild this morning here, so.
is it? Oh, well, I'm in Europe and it's pretty cold here. It's not heating up.
Still. Oh no. I feel like you
Oh,
guys
it's
get
just,
spring earlier though. You get lots of like lovely little flowers
you're
before the
absolutely
States
right.
do.
Yeah, we've had the snowdrops, we've had the daffodils. Now
Mm.
it's fully in bloom. So yeah, you're very on it with that. Well, it's a real pleasure to have you on this series, the inaugural episode of BioFutures 2. And as you know, yeah, as you know, we kicked off last year with the built environment, and now we're getting a bit more intimate. We are all about the body, health, and
Mhm.
well-being this season. So you seem to me the perfect person to kick this series off with.
Amazing. Yeah. What
Brilliant.
what
Well,
inspired that shift in scale?
yeah. Yeah. Well, you know, it's a hard choice because there are a lot of really inspired women in this sector, aren't there? And some amazing projects going on.
What inspired that shift in scale from the city to the body?
Oh, sorry, I didn't hear that. Well, it was about really just sort of bringing it down. So we went big last season. So we were really looking at the landscape scale,
Mm.
and we were discussing everything from the future of cities to buildings to into the home. So we've kind of scaled it down. And also because one of the big things that was coming out in the last series was the connectivity between the body and the environment, and the shifting relationships that we've got going on, wherein, you know, this is not a linear
Yeah.
problem that we're solving here. So yeah, that was part of it. And also because, you know, we had 9 of the seminal thinkers from the field last year, so we covered a lot of bases.
Yeah, I guess that's a good point, that like you can't look at these scales in isolation, that like you can't look at the site of the body without also being in contact with the entire global and ecosystem scale as well.
Absolutely, absolutely, and that interconnectivity. And I think we've you know, we've so far seen a lot of hints at what we might do, but we're now getting into that realm where it's really opening up. And so, as someone that's worked with some really interesting materials and that is very alert to the potentialities there, I thought, you know what, Charlotte's going to be the person that we kick the series off with.
Happy to be here.
Brilliant. Well, I've got a few questions for you. Now, these are from the perspective that we're going to have a bit of a mix of people seeing this both live and recorded. So some of the people that are going to see this are going to be in our sphere. They're going to know who you are. They're going to know your past projects.
I'm seeing Brown RISD Innovation just joined. So yes, some people will know me.
Yeah, you can see them joining up. But some of these people will be completely fresh to this.
Yeah.
So they won't even know the field, let alone you and your work. So that's where we're coming from here. So I wanted to kick off with, it's always interesting to hear how people first came to this domain, and particularly for you because your work is very situated around tackling climate change and the big sustainability issues. So I wanted to know what really first inspired you to get involved.
Yeah. Yeah, so even backing up from there, hi everybody, I'm Charlotte McCurdy. I'm currently an assistant professor of industrial design in the design school at Arizona State University, which is new to me this year. So I'm like shifting ecosystems coming from the East Coast of the United States. And my work as a designer, I come to design from sustainability strategy because my sort of operating hypothesis is that some of the biggest barriers for tackling climate change in particular are not necessarily challenges of technology, but challenges of imagination, vision, collective will. And I'm American. I come from that American perspective. I imagine you have a European audience that my like worldview will seem American in certain ways. In terms of maybe the intrinsic politicization of issues of sustainability in the future. So I come to biomaterials, perhaps what might be called biodesign, kind of backwards, right? I come from an interest in climate change and how we hold on to it in our mind's eye, and came to biomaterials because zooming out, getting to be a designer, one thing I like about being a designer is that you get to ask for clarity. You get to ask the stupid questions over and over and over again and ask for information to be presented in a way that actually speaks to the way we think, right? Like there's plenty of psych research that shows that we're not even good at holding on to percentages. Like we're primates, like we're not, like we are nature, right? Like, and we think in count, we think in object. And so I sort of came to the climate space and was asking questions like where is the carbon? Like conservation of mass, short of asteroids, there's a finite amount of carbon on Earth. Where is it? How did it get there? What's going on? And just with that question, for instance, had this like sort of insight moment around the relationship between biology and geologic time and where these materials are, right? So one of my favorite examples of this is when you look at the Carboniferous period. It's a band of 100 million years where 300 million years ago, where plants developed the ability to produce lignin, fantastic structural polymer that let things go up. So we went from a landscape of ferns to trees, and it took 100 million years for fungi and bacteria to figure out how to break it down. So for that window, plants were growing, pulling carbon down out of the air, piling up, not rotting and accumulating, and that's where our coal comes from. So we have this conception that these fossil fuels, these petrochemical feedstocks are synthetic, somehow separate from the natural. But if you zoom out, it's always life. It's this intersection of evolution, mismatch, and geology. Like, and that was like this sort of moment of like, oh, why isn't this the way I've been thinking about these things? What happens if I keep pulling this thread? And also, sorry, backing up, why am I here? What I'm best known for is out of this research, I developed a plastic alternative that's made entirely out of marine macroalgae that then I've made apparel out of, textiles and apparel out of. So there's a raincoat, there's a dress that I made with the fashion designer Philip Lim that I use to try to start new conversations about climate change, try to create space for imagining a decarbonized future where we're collaborating with life, with organisms that are currently in this carbon cycle, and the possibility of creating a abundant society where we meet our needs, but we get off of our dependence on the carbon that's underground, these fossil fuels, these fossil carbons, and instead can be using the carbon that's currently in the biosphere and not the short-term carbon cycle and not the long-term carbon cycle. Period. Sorry, that was a very long introduction, but that's me.
It captured it. And I think from that, what came out is that the general themes that you're researching are those that are, I mean, certainly in my own research and in a number of the peers that I work closely with, it's that transition from the lithic sources to the living sources. So the geological to the living, but also the fact that as you highlighted, there are false boundaries. At what point does the fossil, but what point does the living become the fossil? And then of course it becomes reabsorbed. So it's really interesting that, we're kind of at this point in design when the boundaries of what is, our sort of spatial and our temporal thinking are massively expanding.
Yep.
Yeah.
And I think, and that's something that part of what I was interested in within design is connected to sort of system thinking, system mapping, like how do we as limited human beings who exist on a very particular scale of perception in time and space, how do we start to even begin to wrap our heads around, let alone design for scales like the cumulative concentration of carbon in the atmosphere, let alone multi-generational timescales, let alone so I come from industrial design. Industrial design often likes to, there's a phrase of human-centered design that's held up as a model of how we can make more empathetic, better working, better serving products. But I think we're at a stage where we have to be zooming out, because human-centered is the same thing as anthropocentrism, and it's caused all kinds of problems. So how can we use some of these approaches, but on a larger scale of responsibility, to not just be serving, not just human needs, not just individual human needs, like ignoring time, ignoring the cumulative effects of meeting individual needs. So there's a real shift happening in both technology and technique in terms of processes for thinking about what we want technology to do for us. How can we lead technology, not be led by technology in certain ways?
Yeah. And what I like about your work, I mean, I often relate most to those people that are very hands-on. Mm-hmm. And that's very notable in your work. You've had the concept, you've prototyped a number of the ideas, and on that journey, I mean, you referenced there the After Ancient Sunlight project. But of the projects that you've worked on, what do you think have been the most profound insights that you've gained? What has been the sort of, obviously we've spoken about time and space and how it shifts those dimensions, but what other things have, as a designer, really just blown your mind?
Thank you for that, because I feel like I often get the same questions over and over again, and that I definitely have not gotten that one before. So it's actually fun to think about. What's blown my mind? I think so. As you said, like I'm quite hands-on, and I really, it's important for me to get all the way to a prototype, because I think one thing that's important to me is, and like, so the projects, also garments, like coming from industrial design, making garments, why, like, that's a bad fit. I joke I made the mistake of making a textile, making a garment, because fashion has a huge sustainability problem. I'm sure everyone on this call knows that. And so there's like this appetite of like, help us, which has been fascinating to like learn about that world in a hurry. But in terms of hands-on making, it's important to me not just to ask the question of what if, but to get to maybe this, right? And so why did I make a garment? Because in terms of trying to tell the story about a future where we've decarbonized everything, not just our energy, not just our fuels, but our material culture, right? Because right now, more than half of our textiles are made of fossil fuels. If you look around you, anything that has glue or paint or dye, those are all petrochemical in origin, and they don't have to be. Even steel, right, is a secondary fossil product. To make iron in the steel, you add carbon, and right now that carbon is coming from coal, right? And it doesn't have to be. Graphite in your pencil, graphite, a naturally occurring formation of carbon molecules. There are sources of graphite that are not fossil fuel in origin, but right now it's all made from coal. Carbon fiber, anything with carbon in it, ask the question, where's the carbon from? Like, and it's more than you think. Pharmaceuticals, 98% of pharmaceutical feedstock, petrochemical in origin. And that's where I think we get into this health piece, right? So my starting point, my connection to health is generally more in the mental health domain. I'm totally changing topics, so feel free to get me back on.
No, there is such a close synergy between physical and mental health that, they're one and the same. So you go for
absolutely. So part of my motivation is, and part of my sort of operating assumption around this is that the traditional ways we've been talking about climate change, or coming, I'm an outsider to sort of the environmental movement too. I'm coming from design, and coming from thinking about sort of the behavioral constraints of how people interact with the world. And so a lot of traditional, if I would call it that, environmentalism talks about climate change with this real frame of like blame, shame, personal responsibility, like it's your fault. You should get smaller and disappear and be embarrassed. And there's two things that happen there, at least. And one is that people tune out and walk away, right? Because cognitive dissonance, no person walks around the world thinking of themselves as the bad guy. Everyone looks at their choices and feels justified in the choices they've made. And so if you tell people they're the bad guy, they're just gonna stop listening to you. And so then we're stuck, then we're not making progress. So like, like my goal is to make a difference on climate change, not to be right, right?
Yeah.
It's not enough to be right to make change. And then the other thing that happens is that it's actually kind of limited in its truth, right? When you look at like the personal responsibility angle, because the change that is needed is so systemic. Like LED light bulbs and replacing your straws is not going to do it. And we saw that in the pandemic. So between 2019 and 2020, flying, aviation fell off a cliff. People weren't flying, right? Massive reduction in the number of flights. I'm sure you've heard the phrase flight shaming. There's a lot of logic around like criticizing people for flying. The emissions dropped globally between 19 and 2020, 6.4%. Not enough. Not like the entire global economy ground to a halt, and the drop in emissions was 6%. Not enough, right? So this is not about doing less of what we're currently doing. It's about creating the tools for a new way of generating food, shelter, clothing, and having it be, as you were saying, a transition to living sources, to meeting those needs with the abundance that we already have. Another thing that helps me feel like that's possible is that, and not just going back to standards of living from the pre-industrial revolution, because also that's not an option, because we have 8 billion people now that we are responsible to feeding and sheltering and having dignity and a certain decent quality of life. I firmly believe that. So pre-industrial revolution, obviously our population was not like that. But before the industrial revolution, our most efficient technology for converting solar energy into useful molecules was like grass and C4 corns. Sorry, C4 grasses like corn. And that's about a 2% conversion rate of efficiency. Right now, you can go out and put conventional solar panels on a house, and those are 15% efficient. They're experimental cells that are at 4650, and algae, which is why I use it, is like 4 to 6 times as efficient at conversion as these kinds of grasses. So we can do more with the energy that we have because of, in some ways, the insight and innovation and technology of the Industrial Revolution. So we can get to a new paradigm that's not going to look like the past. It's going to look like something totally new. Okay, but mental health. So, and I can stop too. But it's important. Part of why I make these artifacts from like a near future that's decarbonized is to try to create an inviting and positive vision to talk not about the apocalyptic, because that also gets into the domain of fantasy, right? It becomes sort of a HBO series and not like an actual grinding human tragedy, which is what it currently is, right? Because we're already living with climate change. But to try to tell a hopeful story so that we can get aligned behind it. And I think sometimes that comes across as naivete, but it's absolutely not. It's a strategic, rhetorical move to try to create space for more people to feel like they can hold on to this challenge and not get crushed by it.
Yeah. And, you know, I mean, what you're saying there, I very much think, you know, that what we're talking about here is a design revolution, and it's a manufacturing revolution. And I think the projects that generally fail are those that are quite simply trying to tweak the industrial model. That's all they're trying to do. It's like with architecture, it's the projects that literally sort of posit the idea that you can build a building pretty much as normal, massive carbon footprint, massive everything, very little adaptability, and just stick some trees on it and you're good to go. It's so low in terms of ambition, because as designers, obviously you create your best work when you don't tweak the sort of the problematic thing that somebody else made. You're not trying to sort of retrofit, you're not trying to sort of back engineer, but what you're actually doing is starting from the blank sheet of paper, looking, right, what have we got now? What's the problem? And what is absolutely everything we've got to throw at it? And there are so many extraordinarily exciting ways that we can actually live in a way that is enjoyable, that isn't sacrificial. We're not having to martyr ourselves. But that hasn't got enough visibility right now. But, you know, these ideas are out there, and it's, I hate to quote a cliche, but I mean, as Buckminster Fuller did point out, you know, if you want to shift the paradigm that's not working, you build something better. And I think that's really what you're speaking to.
Absolutely. Yeah. Just telling people that the paradigm they're in is wrong and bad and they shouldn't feel ashamed of it without offering an alternative.
Yeah.
I've not seen that work.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's sometimes I get questioned about like making fashion garments and like trying to, instead of like when I first was prototyping this material and had all these little swatches, like often the feedback I get was like, bubble wrap, go bubble wrap. Those like little weird pillows they put in my Amazon boxes, let's go. And it's, to me, it's like when you look at the history of technology revolutions in our recent time frame, I'm thinking about, like, I call this the Tesla model, where like you have to selling the electric, and that's obviously the persona at the head of that institution is problematic in various ways. But just looking at the car and what the car has done to change the conception of electric vehicles, selling to human desire, like selling it as fast and cool and exciting and not like responsible and friend, like it's important. And then the other example I think of is to start basically, so why start in the low volume, high margin part of the market? It's my view, looking at patterns from history, that the way you can get to scale and to get these technologies to a point where they're accessible to as many people as possible, starting there makes more sense than starting at commodity products. This happened with algae-based biofuels. There was a collapse in the mid-aughts, because if you're competing against commodities, you're competing on cost, and you can't. And new technologies, until they scale, until they're fundamental breakthroughs, are more expensive, and so then you're absolutely creating a trap for yourself. And so I was about to say, the other example I think of is smartphones. Right, the first iPhone in 2007 was very expensive, very high status, very scarce. But now we're at a point where it's something like more than 2/3 of adults on Earth have a smartphone of some kind, right? Like the cost of the manufacturing of those chips was able to collapse, just really shrink down, collapse in a good way. The negative connotations that word, was able to really reduce to the point where this technology is way more accessible. So in terms of the cliche of the future, I do think that there's, just to push back in some ways against what you're just saying, that there's a risk in trying to start from a completely blank slate, right? Because we in all technologies, we are inheriting paradigms. We can't there is no starting from absolute scratch. When you think about like, here's another cliche. When you think about like the standard width of a vehicle right now,
Yeah.
like that norm is a technological legacy of the size of horses, right? And like, it's not, we didn't design the car or the street widths from scratch, right? And maybe we don't want to, because if we're making choices between what to change and update, like reinventing everything is a luxury we don't necessarily have. So how do we proceed as best we can towards the future that we want? And also, like, not another cliche, like have perfection be the enemy of the good, right? So in the plastic space, we probably want things that function as plastics, that are moldable, flexible, hygienic, that do these amazing things for us. We probably want the future of plastics to be renewable and also biodegradable. But to get there, we're probably going to need lots of experiments in renewable but not biodegradable, and biodegradable but not renewable plastics. And if we can't shoot them down and refuse to invest in them because they're not perfect yet, because that's how we're going to get, in my view, to a material ecosystem that's better, that meets our goals.
And also, you know, I'd say on designing within the existing parameters, for want of a better word, I think when we bring the right people together, we can actually do that. So speaking to cars, if we take a great American innovation, the Aptera, the most efficient EV in the world, very different in terms of its design morphology. It's obviously designed to be very, very aerodynamic. They've taken away one wheel, so it's 3 wheels to reduce the friction on the ground. They've integrated solar panels, and so you've got a vehicle that on one charge can do 1,000 kilometers, and that if you only drive a short distance, you can literally park outside your house and it will self-charge, so you never have to fuel it. When they obviously designed that, they didn't actually bring in car designers. They went out and they got experts in aeroplane design, among other things. They looked at how they could re-engineer as I said, the form to reduce the friction. Brought the the fuel consumption right down, re-engineered the materials, because they realized that the traditional materials you build a vehicle with are too heavy. So at every angle, but actually if you look at the parameters, sort of the spatial parameters of the car, they have created something that works with pre-existing roads, pre-existing parking spaces, because as you say, you can't, particularly when you're talking about the built environment, you can't necessarily make certain changes without ironically upping the amount of carbon and pollution. So there are some, as it were, I guess we call them compromises.
Hi, Kanchi! I believe that project, isn't that vehicle, has the same aerodynamic drag as just the rear view mirrors on the Ford F-150 or something crazy, just those big ears that stick off of that truck.
It's about that, because literally when you look at the airflow in the modeling, it's just going right over it. It's just and that was a biomimetic project. So they were looking at things like marine birds when they dive into the water to reduce drag, all of that kind of stuff. So again, that was inspired by nature, but the level of ambition in that project was very much, okay, right, you know, we want to make the most sustainable vehicle in the world, and taking that from every single angle. So I think it's very much a sort of a benchmark of what we can do, and it's a very beautiful, desirable thing. I guess the challenge with an Aptera is that I love it. I think many designers would love it, because we're not afraid of radical design. But when I've shown it to a couple of my investor friends, they've said, oh, is that not a little bit too out there for most people? Because, you know, it would turn heads if you were driving down the road. But then again, isn't that what a whole load of people want? I mean, you know.
Are you familiar
Isn't that why people buy Porsches and things?
Are you familiar with Loewy's concept of Maya? This is a mid-century design project, most advanced yet acceptable. So this is a assertion, it's not empirically based, that when you're introducing new technologies, how do you introduce the most advanced yet acceptable version of that? Because what you're talking about, this like resistance, this fear, this reaction, is totally understandable, right? And I think when I talk to non-designers in the space, people coming from maybe the engineering side or the science side, there can be this very like condescending attitude of like, if only the people just got it, like just knew as much as I did, then they would embrace this technology and this future we're building. And it's like, no, you got to meet people where they're at and like have compassion and empathy for like people's real lives. That's how I view as a designer. And we can build a path towards the super aerodynamic Aptera, but if we don't invest in it, we don't get people excited about it along the way, it's never going to happen at all, right? So like, what's the strategy? What's the path? What's the plan? When you look at the history of technology, there's all kinds of examples of this where like when the elevators went from being operated to being button and automatic, there's a whole window there where there still was a human operator who would push the buttons for you to help people build that bridge and understand that this was safe, that it would work. But you can't ask people to jump foot first into something they don't necessarily trust. We're seeing that with autonomous vehicles too. I'm in Arizona right now, one of the friendliest states to autonomous vehicles. There are cars right now that have no one behind the wheel driving around. And it's uncanny. Even as like kind of a futurist myself, I definitely rubberneck. I'm the one who's going to cause accidents, not the driverless car, because I'm like, is there anyone supervising this one? Yeah. But that's exactly it. Like we are humans, we're curious, we're flawed. And how do we design with that and not against that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess the challenge is that the distribution of people is so mixed. I mean, when it comes to the psychology behind this, obviously some people fear change and they want tradition, which is why they would want something that, be it a vehicle or be it an attire, apparel, a home, they want something very conventional because that's what they know to work, to feel safe. That doesn't make them stand out. And then you've got the opposite of that. But all of these people are spread right throughout society. So it's not as if you could kind of create a little pilot city. You know, those have always failed. I mean, most of the sort of the kind of futuristic cities that are built from the ground up, they do go the way of the 70s sci-fi most of the time, because people rebel and they don't feel comfortable in those kind of environments. So it's, as you say, I think at the level of psychology, you know, it is quite challenging, which is where your background as an industrial designer, I think is really useful. I didn't know about the lifts. That's a great analogy.
Well, and I think part of what you're articulating, or I'm like picking up from what you're saying, is that like this impulse to start from first principles, right? To start from this blank slate. There's plenty of examples of that failing, especially when it was done with this modernist top-down God's eye view mode. I think part of what's exciting about design right now is with this more biology inspired, emergent, co-design, participatory design, how can we have design from first principles be collaboratively co-generated instead of imposed from the top down, from the mind of a single visionary genius, right? Like we've seen how that fails to account for certain things, and maybe we're at a place, and I think this also connects to computation. Doing this kind of complex collaboration would not have been possible in terms of the amount of information that we have to manage. So it does feel uniquely like we're in a position to approach these questions. On the revolutionary blank slate thing, again, I definitely believe that in order to get where we're going, we have to build with an understanding of what we're inheriting in many, many ways. But I will say that for my work around the algae material, it was an important thought experiment for me to say, if we were building a material culture on Mars, what would we make things out of? Because Mars does not have fossil fuels underground. We wouldn't bring animals all the way to space to use their co-products and byproducts, right? The efficiency of like growing plants to feed the animal to get we wouldn't do that, right? So the thought experiment of if we were to make plastic on Mars, we would make it out of algae. Like we make it directly from the products of photosynthesis, because that it like, and so that as like as a rule, as a thought experiment for like what I was allowed to work with was really, really helpful. And so that's, I would say, is a sort of like blank slate approach to thinking through the design of a future system that is coherent. Another thing that is important to me in this space, in the biomaterial space, in terms of this like coherent from the start approach, is that often there are a lot of projects in this space that utilize waste streams, right? Like I have a student right now who's taking coffee ground waste and using that as a feedstock to make products. And I think that's important and that's pragmatic. We are in a place where there's tons of unnecessary waste streams. But my caution there is, at what point is this a Band-Aid for an already broken system and becomes an apology that allows those broken systems to perpetuate themselves and say, but we've got this system for ameliorating, back to what you're saying about like modifying the status quo instead of really fundamentally rethinking things. At what point is it a Band-Aid on broken systems? And also, if your feedstocks are the waste of other supply chains, how do you scale? You're intrinsically limited to what you're partnering with. And that's, again, it's not a problem. We need those solutions, but in terms of this long timeline lens of thinking about a system that is coherent, I'd rather, in my practice, which is sort of connected to speculative design, like how can we envision that and then backcast to today and just figure out what our next step is to get there. That's where I have decided to focus. But I'm glad other people are working in like the recycling and waste space, but it's not my primary concern. And partly that's because I'm coming from climate, right? So in terms of emissions, if we only focus on the end of life, the waste, we're missing a huge opportunity to decarbonize our built environment, because the question of where things come from has more to say about which way the carbon is flowing in this system.
Yeah, and I suppose, the thing about algae. Hi,
Arvind. Sorry.
Obviously, speaking to geological epochs past, I've used that as an analogy for humans right now, because pondweed became so prolific in the Arctic in a previous geologic epoch that it actually stripped out so much carbon that it reduced the global mean average temperatures significantly, because it went from 1,000 parts per million carbon in the atmosphere down to 650. And in that process, it terraformed the planet in such a way that it actually extinguished its presence in the Arctic, because the planet then cooled so much that it iced over. And I think that shows you how massive the potential for algae is, because it loves carbon. But
I think that another thing that highlights is it's important to remember that we are not the first form of life to change the atmosphere. I think we can get this hubris around how it's connected to our fantasy of how like powerful and unique humans are. It's like no, biology is happening on a massive scale, and the non-living parts of our environment are constantly in dynamic exchange with the living parts of our environment. And can we have some humility if we start to zoom out on that scale? I feel like it can lend some clarity on like what it is we're doing and what it is we need to do. And it's not like, yes, algae, plants, carbon sequestration.
Yeah. And, you know, the other thing that struck me, I mean, when we speak to things that are radical, I find that there are actually very, very few things that are genuinely new. We think they're new because of our cultural bias. So, for example, you and I started asking the question of, well, how can I, you know, this was my PhD topic, how can I create a city that is resilient, that can coexist with wildfires, that can actually turn the wildfire as a catalyst into renewal while mitigating the challenges of wildfires, by which I looked to the natural world. I looked to the wildfire resilient plants, the pyrophytes. Now, when I very first started that, it seemed to me a new approach, but actually the Pomo tribes of California have evolved an architectural paradigm that effectively already does that, not necessarily using the same technologies, the same material systems, because of course I, like you, was looking to what has emerged from the post-industrial age and really everything we have to play with now, but philosophically very little difference. So it's, well, what's actually new here? And I think that's one of the challenges, isn't it? It's the fact that we do have lots of different approaches around the world, but they've all been sort of entrenched in these different cultures. And actually trying to work out how you, you know, mitigate that, how you sort of cross those divides is a challenge.
Definitely. And I do, and I've had that very much an analogous experience in terms of in my hands-on work with like playing with these, trying to develop these materials, like drawing not just from emerging technology, but how can we learn from before the Industrial Revolution, we made, and many communities still do, make incredible things without fossil fuels, right? And so, for instance, in jumping into the collaboration to make the sequins with Philip Lim, one of his first questions was color, talking about color. And I was like, oh, right, not something I tend to prioritize.
I see, a lot of monochrome going on here.
Let's do that. Let's take a look at that. And like looking into natural dyes, looking into like earth-based pigments, you look at fine art, craft art from around the world from before the Industrial Revolution. There's an incredible palette of colors, right? But right now, vast majority of our pigments are petrochemical in origin. Our azo dyes, our paint, like, and it doesn't have to be. So yes, absolutely. It's not just about new technology. It's about recognizing what humans already know and have perfected experimentally through hundreds of years of collaborating with materials and organisms to see what these things want to do, not just what we can force them to do. So that's super cool on the fire-based built environment, and that there was precedent to look at.
And I think, you know, what you were saying about color, that's interesting, because I think one of the places I look for, I don't do much sort of designing in terms of most of my work systems work now, so sort of designing the system, not the thing. But when I do sort of design work that involves creating a thing, as it were, I often look to medieval painting, to the tempera palettes of the sort of religious art, because the quality, the tonal quality of those paintings is quite extraordinary, because the chemistry is fundamentally different. You know, you get a very different sort of variance in the tones. And you just got me thinking there when you were talking about sort of the algae. What will be the new tonal palettes that are created by these new materials? Will they be the same to the petrochemical color palette, or will they be different?
I think it depends on what we prioritize, right? Because with green and catalytic chemistry, we are more and more able to reproduce exactly the molecules of our synthetic petrochemical age and just have them not be petrochemical in origin, right? So like we can make PET, we can make polyester, exact technical, exactly PET. We can make it now with no fossil fuels. We can make it entirely out of plant sugars through catalytic chemistry. So in some ways there will be aesthetics that are intrinsic to these new technologies, but also depending on what we prioritize, we could one-to-one reproduce a lot of these molecules. Do we want to is a whole other question. right? Because then we are left with a lot of the problems of these. And again, this connects to the health piece, is that like part of why a lot of these additives can be so poisonous is because they're carbon based. We are carbon based. Our body's ability to differentiate between a hormone that is useful and helpful and a carbon based molecule that interacts with our biology as if it were like, so like, do we want, like, I keep pointing at this jacket, like black dye is not good for you. It's really not good, like to have against your skin. And black ink, partially combusted fossil fuels, is a class 2 carcinogen. Like it interacts with us because we are carbon based too. So I hope that we can emphasize and discover the aesthetics, the colors of these ideally more benign molecules of biology-based, nature-based, post-industrial, post-carbon in the underground carbon sense, not post-carbon in the us sense.
Yeah.
I hope we can build a new vocabulary. Yeah,
I think that's really interesting because I mean, one of the things that's really been coming on in health is understanding of the immune system and the fact that our health is effectively shaped by that in terms of obviously our capacity to mitigate disease, the effects of carcinogenic substances on the immune system. In Europe, we're just seeing the EU pass some new legislation because they've realised the nano and the microparticle plastics from food cartons, particularly when the food is heated, are sufficiently dangerous to cause the carcinogenic threat and potentially infertility. Mm-hmm. And what you've been saying, you know, about the dye, the sort of the properties of that, it's making me thinking we're probably only a matter of steps away from policies that could actually outlaw certain dyes and, as you say, certain molecules, because we're getting that depth of information about the implications. We've got all the gear, and now we're understanding. We're getting an idea of, you know, what the impacts of that are.
Yeah, and I would say that again, I'm American, so policy leadership is not what we're known for in this domain. So I tend to look for market-based interventions. So an analogy that I look at is in food, right? So organic food, what the whole foodsification of organic food, a lot of the original thinkers and proponents around organic food, their vision, their argument was based on ecosystem impacts, system scale, desirable outcomes. And part of how that turned the corner on being massively adopted, massively invested in, is when it made the shift to the personal health implications of organic food. And so I think similarly, what you're drawing out here is that we can want a biomaterial, bio-based material ecosystem for all kinds of climactic reasons, ecosystem reasons. But back to that human angle, it might be that legitimate concerns about personal health are how we can turn the corner on large-scale adoption, large-scale regulation in some contexts. And I think we have a lot to learn from what happened in food in terms of how these words got defined and formalized, and in many ways compromised, back to your point about like incremental change instead of deep change. There's every incentive to have the way these terms like bio-based, which is already regulated in America, for instance, but for the wrong reasons. It comes out of the Farm Bill of 2002. You don't have to go there. The way these get formalized is going to, in large part, determine the emergent impact of this adoption and the shift. But with that said, in terms of market-based, the natural food segment, things like Whole Foods, is massively outperformed traditional grocery retail in the last 20 years. Like, there's money to be made in this transition, and like investing in it, having it do work at the right time, at the right scale, for the right people, is like worth doing. And the other thing that I would say about this connects a little bit to the accident of making a garment, is that textiles have been on the leading edge of every major industrial revolution of humans. Like, it's been undervalued because it's culturally associated with the feminine. So it's downplayed as a leading edge of innovation. But agricultural revolution was wheat and flax for linen. Computation, obviously, jacquard looms. Like, materials and textiles in particular have a funny habit of being a leading indicator.
I knew that's interesting actually for this whole space, because when you look at what areas have grown, so my first project in the space was back in 1994. It was a college project where I envisaged a fashion collection, pret-a-porter collection that would biodegrade at the end of the season, so it would be reabsorbed by the environment, which back then, I mean, there was no chance of getting any traction in fashion at all. And I was very first attracted to the material side of it, because I realized, well, you can't go reinventing fashion if you don't start at the molecular level and the materials upwards. But in that time, when we look at, I mean, there are so many different ways in which you can draw inspiration from nature, be the materials, the design, the engineering, whatever it might be. But it right now, sort of on a project basis, it's the biomaterials space that is exploding. I mean, there are more projects than it's possible to track now. And yet there are other areas where, there's some amazing projects, like in, architecture, but they are proportionately very small in number compared to materials. So I think what you said there is spot on. It seems that we are reproducing, we're sort of, that pattern is emerging here. And, with those biomaterials, a lot of the interest is around garments. It's around both your own projects and several others have really kind of catalyzed that public imagination and managed to get this into the mainstream.
And I do really find that there's something very, very approachable, and it's just so human. It's intrinsically human scale garments, right? Even compared to making furniture, like, there's something very immediate about a garment. And like, I think, you imagine, there's this projection. You imagine yourself in it, and in that alternative reality, there's something, and also the health piece. I think there's so much we're understanding about how permeable our skin is as an organ. I think.
Can you see, thinking about that, can you see materials being engineered in a way that serves very particular health conditions, for example, that is used in a way, sort of a reconciliation tool?
I mean, there already are examples in some cases of textiles that have health benefits. What's tricky about this is that we're back in this domain of regulated claims, right? In the same way that like supplements are not regulated and can make claims. I think we run the risk of materials that are authentically beneficial competing with others that make claims that are not third-party validated. So it's like this sort of trap of like, third-party auditing creates clarity and accountability, but then it also creates more barriers to entry, which makes it harder for small entrepreneurs, small beginning stage like projects to break in. This I've definitely seen in the fashion space, where the formalization of claims around fashion create so much expense to be in compliance, to be reporting, that young, starting out, visionary, like really inspired, aspiring fashion designers that I speak to, who are in particular, who are coming from marginalized communities, don't have access to the financing to launch. they feel completely blocked out from practicing sustainable fashion, sustainable design, because it's being designed for these major international players. So it like, it's like it's a real bind. Like, how do you create accountability without ossifying an industry and getting stuck in what you've already described as like these like marginal improvements on a broken system, instead of creating space for real deep innovation? I don't know. I think it's another one of those like incremental. How do you take steps on the path, and not end up throwing your hands up in despair?
And in terms of scaling, I mean, one of the things I find that in this general sort of biodesign, biomaterial space, there are many different ideas about how we make this real at the industrial scale, as it were. Some people see this as being very decentralized. Other people see it as, again, a bit of a replica of the industrial model, where it's happening in factories and what have you. What's your vision for the future of materials production?
Yeah. Hi, Nell, by the way. This question of the future of not just materials, but how it's manufactured, to me, ultimately connects back to the pragmatic question of what's your priority and how do you work towards that, right? So like, there are all kinds of knock-on benefits to localized production in terms of labor, in terms of resilience. But I always get cautious that if we start prioritizing everything, then we're prioritizing nothing. And to me, my central guiding urgency is climate change. And like, for instance, like I firmly believe we do not have time to reinvent capitalism before we take on climate change. Like, there will be very little left to reinvent in not too long. Sorry, back to, this is like the heavy part. Like, this is why we talk about like the inspiring, the visionary, because as soon as we get into these like real pragmatic pieces, it like, it like locks up the gut in a certain way. So I think it's pragmatically, it's going to be some of both. So in terms of the questions, so for just keeping to algae, it's not enough for me that plastics it's not sufficient to have things just be made of algae, right? If the core is net carbon emissions, it absolutely matters how it's cultivated, right? Because if you're pumping fossil fuels into the fertilization or the management or the boats or the supply chain, you're still in a industrial system. This is part of why bioplastics that are made of corn in America are not necessarily so great on a carbon perspective, because then you're complicit with the industrial agricultural system around corn. Most of the PLA in America is made of corn. In Europe, most of the PLA is made of beetroot from the beet sugar supply chain. And you're in that question of like food versus fuel in terms of what are you diverting in place of what. That's another reason why marine macroalgae is exciting, because we have, again, how do we do more with what we already have in terms of sunlight, and not just be trading one thing for the other. So there's some great examples of aquaculture being done at a localized scale, which produces knock-on like food desert benefits, labor work benefits for fishing communities, say, that have lost their livelihoods because of collapse of supply. So I think there will be that, but there also, I think, will be and will need to be large-scale aquaculture production, because if we're trying to substitute our demand for petrochemical feedstock plastics, the scale of that is just intense. Demand for plastic is projected to triple by 2060, and our recycling rates are at like 9%. Like, we can't recycle our way out of that demand.
No, no.
And when we talk about carbon,
the other thing we've got to think about, your BA was in economic development, and I guess thinking about the reality of the economics of this, because we know that through that bigger scale production, you can generally bring your production costs down.
Yep.
So, I think there's, as you say, there's many factors to consider here, and it's really refreshing to hear your pragmatism, because very often we do hear the extremes. We hear the sort of ideal vision, but that realistically is not going to manifest in the timescales that we need. I replace capitalism, and then at the other end of the extreme, we find a lot of stuff that is just too modest in its expectation, and so getting that place in the middle is difficult. And your mindset, I think, is absolutely aligned with that, of actually weighing up how we navigate this really complex space.
Then also, I think the only thing I'd add to that, I know we're probably coming up on time, is that I'm here and doing this from a design perspective because I'm a big believer that sustainability, and I don't like that word generally, is not a destination, right? There's no like ideal thing where we're going to get it, right? It's going to be always a process of renegotiating. Like, as we learn more, our goals are going to change. As we get more inclusion on whose voices are being part of these conversations, what we're prioritizing is going to keep evolving. And my goal is to be part of a system that can keep asking for more, not just, I'm not dogmatically interested in like a single destination, because as soon as we get there, we're going to learn a lot. And that's why I think it's a design mindset, right? That like, this is going to be iterative. It's going to be prototypes. It's going to be a continual process, not like an engineered pinball machine that will be perfect. Like, I think that's an illusion too.
So I've got just 2 more questions for you.
Okay.
I ask them of everyone in the series. So the first is, the year is 2050. What do you see? What is your vision for where the work, the school that you are within is going to go, and for society?
Again, maybe this is me being pragmatic. 2050, what is it, 2023? So basically just 25 years from now. I think 2050 there will be new complexities and new hardships. As I've said, we're already in climate change. Like, there will be increased stresses on our food system, on our migration systems. But also by 2050, we will have created technologies and processes and implemented them in a way that will have made a difference, and will be continuing to make a difference. So to me, in 2050, there will have been a lot of good work done and a lot more to do, and a lot, but also there will still be a lot of suffering. But I think we can't, even with that, we can't lose sight of, it's hard to like account. There's like how do you measure what didn't happen, right? Like, yeah. I think everything we do today that makes a positive impact, that helps reduce suffering, is worth doing, even if we can never meet those people who weren't displaced, that didn't go hungry. So I think by 2050, my vision is that there will have been a lot of good work done, probably some mistakes too, and hopefully we've done proceeded in ways that have allowed us to learn to do and do better and continually do better. That's, I think, the best question we can hope for. Okay.
Your final question. If a genie popped out of a lamp and gave you just one wish it would grant you to help make a better future, could be for you, it could be for society, for anything, what would the wish be?
My wish would be that everyone on Earth, humans, could have even just a moment of a sense of their agency and connection to this impossibly interconnected world we have built in our building, and to see that they have agency. And this is different than personal responsibility, because I don't want everyone to feel bad about the straw in their cup, but to see that every system they touch in terms of food, community, energy, built environment, every time they interface with the world around them, that they have agency to move this enormous ship, to be part of moving the ship, if we all do it together.
That's a beautiful wish. So I hope there's some supernatural entity up there that was listening and will grant that wish. Well, it's been a real pleasure to speak with you. The only shame is we don't have longer. But
yes, absolutely. But this is the beginning of a conversation. It's so great to meet you, Melissa.
Yep, and I'm just so glad you're part of this collective. There are, you know, as I said, a number of really amazing people. There are a lot of women, because to be honest, you cannot run a series in this space without not having a lot of great women, because there are so many pioneers, and I think we're really lucky in that sense, that we've got a field that, at least in one respect, is not reflecting some of the less not attractive, the less desirable trends in society. We're kind of bucking the trend here, so that's a positive. But hopefully we'll be able to pick up the conversation very soon. So to everyone that joined us both live and that will join us in the recordings, thank you for being part of this. And if you have any comments, please do post them. And the highlights from this conversation will join at the end of every series. I gather key insights, key visions, and a document will be produced, and so you can read that, and I'll share that at the end of the series.
And I gotta say, you got some visionaries in the comments too. Hi, Brenda.
Brilliant. Well, I'm definitely going to have to run a few series, because there are a lot of people that we need to get in conversations here. Brilliant. Absolutely. And just to say, next week we have got the founders of Mycotex are going to be joining us on the 3rd, and then on the 4th we have Veronica Rana. So we've got two great well, in fact 3. There are 2 ladies that founded Mycotex, and we'll be carrying on this conversation. So thank you for joining us, and thank you, Charlotte, and I will be back next week for episode 2. Bye bye.